In this seventh part of the series on the philosophical nature of psychotherapy and narcissism as a subject of psychotherapy, I discuss reasons for my belief that despite their deficiencies in being able to show empathy and their sensibility for others, narcissists cannot be morally excused for hurting others. There's a story in Christian ethics which focuses our responsibility to develop particular moral sensibilities in order to merit redemption. According to the story, encapsulated in the Christian legacy attributed to a vision by Venerable Theodora of Constantinople, upon a person's death, their soul leaves the body and on its ascent passes through several groups of demons, which Saint Theodora calls aerial toll houses, where each group of the demons tests the soul for any remaining sinful inclinations, including greed, gluttony, adultery, arrogance, etc. Should the soul fail any of these tests, the corresponding group of demons will snatch it away from its normal ascent to heaven and drag it into hell, preventing its salvation, its redemption. This metaphorical story is interesting both ethically and soteriologically for several reasons. First, it describes a situation after the person's death, which traditionally in Christianity marks the end of a person's effort in this life, and assuming that the person has acted in sufficiently virtuous ways, ought to guarantee redemption of the soul. Thus, it would appear odd that the soul continues to be tested for its choices after death. According to the story, while ascending towards heaven, the soul actively decides whether to respond to temptation with various sins offered at a specific aerial toll houses, as St. Theodora calls them. These tests being conducted by groups of demons. And if it has not cleansed itself, the soul, of the inclinations or sensibility to respond to sinful experiences, the soul is drawn by the sin and fundamentally and ultimately loses the chance to redeem itself. The concept is similar to the view by Emanuel Swedenborg, who, when interpreting redemption, argues that, quote, God does not condemn anyone to hell, end of quote, rather everyone goes where the inclinations of their soul lead them. The second curiosity with this story is that it suggests that in order to achieve sufficient virtue, it is not enough to act right, thus passing the ethical evaluations of our actual choices. What is required is that one works on oneself by undergoing a discipline and moral training in order to attain a personal change, namely the change of sensibility which will cause the person to no longer wish to engage in moral wrongdoing or in otherwise ethically suspect choices. This is what is tested by the toll houses described in the story. This is a key concept in the ethics of personal change that originated in ancient Greek ethics. For example, in Epicurean ethics, which postulated the cultivation of sensibilities of the soul. The same principle of the duty to self-change marked the very beginning of modern psychotherapy in the affective psychopathology of Philippe Pinel, the founder of the modern psychotherapeutic clinic, who regarded all psychotherapy as, quote, moral re-education, end of quote. Pinel insists that the moral failures inherent in disturbances such as what we call today personality disorders, in fact arise from failing to observe the duty to self-change and to cultivate one's own sensibility. This is a type of psychotherapeutic virtue ethic that Pinel saw as being at the very methodological core of psychiatry and psychotherapy. The concept of moral education or re-education, initially championed by Pinel along the historical legacy of various ancient Christian and other sources on the moral duty of self-care and change and living the good life, attaining religious virtue, or later in the related ethics for psychiatry and psychotherapy, is reflected in Louis Charland's important argument that the cluster B personality disorders, including narcissistic personality disorder, and thus also narcissism as a type of personality organization, are in fact moral and not strictly medical qualifications. Charland points it out that almost all of the diagnostic criteria for the Cluster B disorders elaborated in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 4 are in fact moral and not clinical failures. Thus, the psychotherapeutic treatment for such disorders would naturally be expected to focus on a moral re-education along Pinel's affective psychopathology, the principle that brings psychotherapy in the aegis of philosophy, and that is gaining increasing prominence through the modern development of philosophical counseling, which addresses philosophically the specifically moral and existential themes in appropriate cases of psychopathology. Given that social structure, namely our relationships with others, constitutes a dynamic action system, in the philosophy of psychiatry and psychotherapy, the traditional ethical difference between failing to do something good and actively doing something morally bad is diminished. The context of psychotherapy as an action system consists of legitimate expectations that the choices one makes are aligned with appropriate social values. This includes the person's possession of a requisite virtue and sensibility to fulfill the legitimate expectations. There is thus a moral duty involved in self-care and self-change to the extent that they are required in order to facilitate the person's actual fulfillment of legitimate moral expectations in society. And this includes the development of a required degree of moral emotions as dynamic drivers of moral action, such as empathy, loyalty, solidarity, etc. As I have pointed out before, narcissism is a personality structure that satisfies Petit's value criteria 2 and 3 for a full moral responsibility. Namely, the narcissist is able to understand what is expected of them, that this expectation is legitimate, and the narcissist has control of their choices and actions. In light of the legitimate expectations within the social action system that is captured by psychotherapy, it seems reasonable to derive from the above that the narcissist has a moral duty to develop the appropriate sensibility through moral discipline and self-education so that they can actually fulfill the legitimate moral expectations that they are aware of. More recently, John Torrey presented arguments for what he calls an exaltation account of moral blamelessness based on the idea that the existence of a legitimate excuse arising from an inability to perform an action which is the subject of moral duty renders the agent blameless, even though one has a moral obligation and is aware of that obligation. Torrey's argument in favor of the exaltation account is consistent with the second McNaughton criteria of criminal responsibility, which at the same time is a criterion of moral responsibility, namely the agent's ability to have acted otherwise. The same argument is also consistent with Petit's third criterion for moral blameworthiness, namely the ability to exercise control. However, the narcissistic personality, as it is clinically described in the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual classifications, clearly retains significant control of their choices, which means that their pathology does not arise from an inability to choose, but from an inability to accord sufficient weight to values which would motivate them to choose morally correctly. Thus, the narcissist chooses morally wrongly when they do so, not because they are unable to act otherwise, but rather because they are strongly disinclined while able to do so, and this lack of motivation is associated with values, not with psychological capacities. In a social action system, the moral duty to meet legitimate expectations involves the duty to develop a capacity to do so, where this is within the individual's power. A duty of self-care requires the person to regularly exercise, and if the person is too obese to exercise, this then requires a duty to lose weight in order to be able to exercise and thus prevent damage to one's health and one's becoming a burden on others. The fact that one cannot exercise because one is too overweight does not excuse one from the duty to care for one's health. To the contrary, this imposes a further moral duty to lose weight in the interest of health. Far more radically, if one's limited capacities for empathy or for the drama of moral dilemmas impact the welfare of others, rather than merely of the person herself, as is the case with narcissism, the duty to change is even more stern and radical. The lack of moral sensitivity to do what one knows is one's moral obligation, which one is able to fulfill because one has control of one's actions, far from excusing one from moral responsibility, in fact increases one's responsibility to develop such a sensibility, and to the extent that one could have worked on self-change, makes one blameworthy for the lack of moral training and moral emotions. The context of psychiatry and psychotherapy further increases this duty. While the obese person can neglect their health all by themselves without actively relating to others, the narcissist neglects their moral and personal well-being exclusively by consistently abusing others. Through the described mechanisms of narcissistic validation and treating others as narcissistic supply, the exclusively social substance of the narcissist dynamics maximizes the narcissist's moral duty of self-care and self-change, correspondingly increasing the narcissist's moral responsibility for failing Petit's test 1 while satisfying the tests 2 and 3, where the latter qualified the narcissist to work on satisfying test 1. Hence, it is reasonable to conclude that failing Petit's tests of value sensibility does not in fact diminish the narcissist's moral responsibility. To the contrary, the action system that defines the narcissist personality within the context of psychiatry and psychotherapy increases the narcissist's moral responsibility. This makes the conclusion with regard to the narcissist's moral responsibility for their choices identical to the accepted practice with regard to the narcissist's legal responsibility, namely that narcissists are fully legally and equally fully morally responsible for their actions.